Now we're going to begin discussing the changes and the implications of those changes. We'll start with Paul Lundquist.
Great, thank you. One thing to point out is that to a lot of voters who are understanding this or hearing about it for the first time, they think of it as a bifurcation charter revision. There's actually, as we're saying tonight, 4 different pieces to this, but the one principal component is the idea that we're bifurcating the vote, meaning separating the town and the education budgets. The benefit of that is that we've seen from voters this year and also in recent years before this, there's certainly a tendency for certain groups of voters to have greater interest, concern, and awareness of the town budget versus the education budget. So we really wanted to offer an opportunity through this action to really allow them to focus on those areas where they might realize that it's not one single budget, even though that's how it's been treated in the past. It really is 2 pretty unique buckets, and they represent significantly different value or cost in the overall budget itself.
I think one of the points that I thought was important is the fact that voters understand when you bifurcate what's on one side of the budget and what's on the other side of the budget. So the education budget that you're going to be voting on is purely the operational expenses for the education side of the overall budget, and the municipal budget includes all the revenue, the municipal operations budget for all the activities that will be happening during the year, and the debt service. So those are the 2 sides of the budget.
Right, and it may even be fair to touch on the fact that some people may feel that it's one town, we should have one budget. As Marianne alluded to, there are components of the budget that are separate, but there are also some pieces of the budget that are very interdependent. Even ownership of certain facilities, maintenance of some of these facilities, and certainly when there's long-term borrowing for capital improvement projects, that debt is held on the town side. Okay. So while the budgets are very distinct and have very different weights in total in the overall town budget, it's fair to consider the fact that there are some pieces that are not easily separated.
Yeah, the debt service specifically is, as Marianne said, on the town side. However, the burden of the debt is caused by capital expenditures on both education and municipal capital projects. One clarification is Marianne mentioned the expenditures and the revenue, but really when we vote on the budget, we vote only on the expenditures, not the revenue. The mill rate is sort of set to balance the 2.
Okay, so what would let's break into another part of the question, which folks will really need to either read about on placards or on flyers that are at the polls or through the Newtown Bee or the town website, right?
Yes, and we do plan on sending out a mailer describing the advisory explanatory text that will accompany the ballots ahead of time, so voters will see that.
So now, aside from the bifurcation of the budget, what's the next element of the charter revision?
The second element is whether or not the results of each of the individual budget will be binding, and John touched on that when he gave the overview. Essentially what that means is if one side of the budget, say education passes, and the other side of the budget, the municipal side in this case, fails, the only side that will go back to the council for consideration is the municipal side of the budget. And vice versa, if the education side does not pass and the municipal side does pass, then the municipal side will not go back to the voters, but the education side will. And I think one of the points that people need to make sure they're clear about is in that scenario, if the education budget does not pass, but the municipal side does pass, and the voters, when we talk about the advisory questions, if the voters want the budget to be increased, that the end result there has to be a tax increase, and we can talk about that more when we get to the advisory question section as well.
May I ask just quickly from John Godin what perhaps a brief but key point of the critical mass of research yielded to the commission in making that recommendation of the council?
Binding versus non-binding? Um, that was a it was an interesting discussion. I mean, what we did, first of all, to decide whether we bifurcate or not, is we looked at comparative towns similar to our town, Newtown, and we looked at towns such as Simsbury, Madison. We looked at New Milford, who had very similar characteristics as far as size, wealth characteristics, student populations. It's not all perfect, but we looked at what they did. And in the case of Simsbury and Madison, they had what I would call some kind of a binding piece in their charter. And I say some kind. What I've learned over 3.5 weeks of research is not every charter is perfect, and ours isn't actually that bad. But what we found is in those two cases of Simsbury and Madison, they continually passed their budget, even with a binding provision to it. And at the end of the day, if I were in the shoes of the Legislative Council and I were voting on a budget and it was separate and bifurcated, and this is my personal opinion, I think this was the opinion of some other members of the commission, is I don't think I'd want to go back a second try if I've already put one to bed. So I think it's other towns that have the provision, they've done well with it, and to some extent you also run the risk, if it's non-binding, you could be going back and forth to the polls where one passes and a subsequent vote it fails, and this could go on and on and on, and we could go beyond 5 votes. And that was not in the intent of the Charter Revision Commission.
And was this the kind of information that made an impression on the council, to our council members on the panel?
Yeah, I think so. In my opinion, I think we are a representative form of government, but when we have a machine vote, that's the closest to actually hearing what the people want. And so my opinion, to take that and then to not accept it, if one side passes and the other doesn't, to not accept that, that would certainly isn't very democratic, and I would prefer I tend to agree with John's analysis that we should let that one stand.
I mean, that in itself provides very clear direction for us. It ensures that someone's vote, if one part of the budget passes, that their vote isn't reconsidered or discounted in any way. It's very clean, very obvious, and I think that that's one of the things that people were looking for in this past budget cycle.
Yeah, I agree. For me personally, I think I think more voters would be disenfranchised if their vote was dismissed. I mean, we saw people being disenfranchised this year because they thought their votes weren't being interpreted correctly. They would be even more outraged, I think, if their votes were dismissed. So that was important for me as well.
And yet, I would just add that, one of the things that, for better or for worse, that we experience every year is that some information regarding the budget, some of those details emerge throughout the budget cycle. It's not a cut and dry yes or no set of facts and set of numbers at the very first vote. So throughout the budget process, some of the things like commodity spending, insurance, some of other HR type issues are coming into us as we're throughout the budget season. And in some ways, a voter might think that if one part of the budget has already passed, then all those new learnings are off the table. So it ties to council's hands in some ways, but we really, and the voters really, need to weigh the benefit and the concern there.
Well, and however, I think the fact that the Board of Selectmen specifically cannot move money around within their budget once it's passed without a vote that encompasses the Board of Finance and the Legislative Council in public meetings ensures that if their insurance goes down during the year and they want to use that money for something else, there's 25 people who have to be in on that decision to make that change. And the recent changes to the Board of Education budget makes a similar thing happen as well.
And the last piece is that there's often opportunity in a very positive frame of compromise where there's some swapping from the municipal side to the Board of Ed so that we can overcome the barrier that you mentioned earlier, where the only way to add money to a budget would be to increase taxes. And the current system of moving money between the budgets, although not desirable and usually, happens after a couple of budget failures because we're all in a state of compromise at that point, that flexibility may be limited.
Right.